cultures and behaviors and ideas of gender and sexuality shift radically over time. And I just think that queerness that doesn't look like us is present in every translation we make. Every time, every attempt we make to try and recover the past, we recognize that difference, that rupture from the past. And in that difference, in that rupture, in like the bits that aren't there, I think a whole queer history is quietly existing.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you like what we do and want to make a contribution, you can become a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. Now join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a queer woman and my pronouns are she and they. In this episode, I have a conversation with Cleo Madeleine, a researcher, activist and poet. Cleo's pronouns are she and her, and she is queer, trans and a woman. Find out what that means to Cleo in this episode. Join us as we briefly go down a rabbit hole of queer history and time, talking about the entanglement of sexuality and gender, linguistic limitations, the intersection of history, language and identity, what is left out of history, the construct of normativity, levels of activism, and the many ways things can get lost in translation. It was recorded on the 14th of August 2022. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Cleo Madeleine. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for being here. Yeah, so I met you at Norwich Pride's Question Time panel in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and well, the rest is history, as they say. So you gave me the terms queer, trans, and woman.
Mm-hmm.
So would you, I would love for you to share a little bit about your gender journey and how you arrived at your, the place you're in now. So
Yeah,
it's a big open
absolutely.
question, isn't it?
No, I mean,
Yeah.
all the best questions about gender are, I find.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, so I suppose my personal history is that I basically came out the womb in a pride flag. I've always been this way, but as a child of Section 28, just didn't have any kind of queer representation growing up or in school. And so I was 15 and found bisexuality and was like, oh, that's me. And then I was maybe in my 19, 20, sort of when I went away to university and learned about sort of the great diversity of gender and trans people. And more gradually was like, oh, this is me as well. And then, so I think a lot of that for me is stuff that's happened, over 10 years ago. But it has been a constant and ongoing journey, part of which I think is because through my academic work, through my activist work, I have kind of constantly been forced at times to question and reevaluate and revisit both what my ideas of my own identity are, but also more broadly what I think sort of philosophically or conceptually about gender and sexuality. But also because, my queer circle has grown. I'm very privileged to have had lots of friends and loved ones who have sort of found their own identities in more recent years. And I've just been so struck by the fact that what unites us as a community is only partially a sense of shared experience and I think sometimes even more so like a tremendous diversity of experience that within the LGBT community we are so radically heterogeneous that even within the trans community our experiences are so distinct, even as we are, I suppose, defined in a relatively limited number of ways by sort of the terminologies available to us by healthcare pathways, by legal definitions, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And so more recently, all of this has led me to question, I suppose, the terminologies that I laid claim to as, when I was a younger queer person, when I was in my late teens, my early 20s. I think actually that's something that we often find quite difficult as queer people, because so much of our struggle for recognition, so much of our struggle for justice is bound up in being able to have a name for ourselves and being able to say, like, this is me, this is who I am, and you and I fought for this and you can't take it from me. That it then actually discourages us from challenging ourselves. One of the conversations I had with myself relatively recently was, I was calling myself bisexual for a long time because I don't really discriminate based on gender when it comes to sexual attraction. And then part of me thought, well, I don't really pursue sexual relationships with men. I suppose actually the catalyst for this was that an opportunity in my life presented where there might have been the opportunity to pursue sexual relationships with men, and I found myself very standoffish about it, and was like, oh, am I just tired of this because I'm in my 30s now, and frankly have far too much to be doing without thinking about adding additional sex into my life. Like,
Yeah.
I've just I have a very high stress work environment.
Yeah.
It's already very logistically challenging. But then part of me was like, when I was, as a trans woman, as a woman full stop, like, I sort of I think that quite often trans feminine people in particular, we don't ever like to talk about the people we were pre-transition, because there's so much at stake in our identities and in our, this weird territorial sense of womanhood, because legally, politically, socially, there are so many movements that are so active and so successful in excluding us from womanhood in a sort of territorial way, that I feel like we try really hard to, and obviously I can't speak for the whole community here. I'm using a kind of murky royal we,
Yeah.
um,
That's fair.
to talk broadly about like a particular paradigm of gender. But I feel like we do try and like really go scorched earth on those elements of our past. But I suppose what I'm talking my way around to is because my first encounter with queerness was understanding about like being gay and being bisexual and not really understanding what gender was. There was some important element of my queerness when I was a teenager that was about sexual attraction to men. And now I'm much, much older. I had this moment where I was like, is that really the case? Or was that just something that was so important to me then that I've nurtured it and carried it with me now? And so I went on this whole sort of like gap year style. Well, it wasn't gap year style. I didn't go anywhere interesting. I just was really annoying to talk to for about 6 months. Just
Went on an inner journey.
Yeah. Well, I think the people in the smoking area would have preferred that it was an inner journey, but it was every opportunity I could to externalize it.
Yeah.
I was sort of asking, well, am I a lesbian? And then, of course, there's a whole political question of I've got this claim to womanhood. What kind of a political claim is lesbianism? What kind of a social claim is it? I have like lots of trans friends at various points on the spectrum of gender who do and do not consider themselves eligible for lesbianism, I guess, in that odd way to treat the taxonomies of gender.
Yeah.
And I suppose partially that's still a work in progress, and partially that's just, I think the outcome of the journey was less that I learned anything particularly enlightening about my sexuality. And if anyone would like to, who's smarter than me, would like to shed light on my sexuality, that would be great. but I suppose also reached a point where I actually just thought, wherever I'm at, trying to migrate between terminologies or trying to rationalize myself into them isn't rewarding me in the way that I thought it might. So I suppose when I say queer, what I sort of mean is partially I am the kind of special treatment snowflake that the right wing press is constantly warning us about, sort of unsatisfied with any of the good hard won terminologies that we've got to talk about our identities, but also I'm somewhere between too lazy and too, God, I don't even know what the word is, too intellectually impoverished to actually figure out what's going on, and I think that's okay.
Totally. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I wanted to revisit a little bit because when you said you were around 15, when you were younger, you were sort of trying to figure out your sexuality, and I think it sounds like I think maybe a lot of the time when people are not familiar with like gender diversity in a way,
Mm,
sexuality is like a first point of maybe contact to that world of gender, maybe. Because
mm.
if you're questioning things about your identity, because I think gender and sexuality are quite entangled, aren't they? So you're figuring out like,
Totally,
am I bi?
yeah.
Am I straight? How I yeah, and then maybe you identify with the person who is that. I don't know. How does that? Yeah, does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I think you're right that they're entangled. I'd even go so far as to say that they're inseparable, and that, and again, I think this owes so much to the political situation, wherein because one of the platforms on the fight, not just for trans rights, but also for things like reproductive justice,
Mm.
on our side is about vindicating the idea that there is a difference between sex and gender, an important difference, and that you can build rights frameworks on it. And on the other side, if we can call it that, obviously it's much more complex on that, but broadly speaking, on the more conservative side, is that there is a difference between sex and gender, and sex has absolute primacy. And that both in both directions, we've inadvertently, I think, ended up propagating quite a conservative mindset or conservative worldview when it comes to the idea that sex and gender are both hallowed, distinct categories.
Mm.
I think a lot of, I have to choose my words very carefully on this because even I'm not quite sure what I mean. And I don't at all
Mm.
want to invalidate anyone else's conception of sexuality and gender identity. But I do think that, for instance, because broadly speaking, gender is where we're looking for the protected category for trans people, there's a really emphatic push to clarify that like gender is really, really important and that sex is less important.
Mm.
But I think that all of us are incomplete beings on constant journeys, finding out new things about ourselves. And
Totally.
part of that is recognizing that not only is sex and consequently sexuality a really important part of us, whatever our journey within or from or around that ends up being, but that it also contains as much diversity as gender, and that we need to be really careful not to describe ourselves as people who embrace the diversity of gender as doing so in reaction away from the sort of staid binary of sex, because I think in doing so we inadvertently project a very conservative view of sex. We kind of rehabilitate those binaries, and I think that because that's the kind of discourse that we've built for ourselves, for a lot of people, yeah, like sexuality and gender identity can seem like things that sometimes, I don't quite know what I'm trying to say here.
That's
Sexuality and
right.
gender identity can seem like things that operate at crossed purposes or distinctly from each other, or that you sort of I think there's this slightly tired narrative that, oh, like I thought I was gay, but actually I was trans, or I thought I was trans, but actually I was gay, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And I think that it's much more complicated, and then actually we're kind of negotiating our way through these ill-fitting words for things, and these cultures of exclusion and isolation. And like in my situation, I don't necessarily use bisexual to describe myself anymore, but I don't
Mm.
necessarily think that I'd therefore be like, oh, well, it turns out I wasn't really bisexual, because that was so meaningful to me then. So I think, yes, you're right that lots of people, less so with young people these days, I think,
Mm.
actually, who
Yeah.
who have much more equal opportunity of access
Hmm.
to like discussion of gender identity as they do to sexuality. But
Yeah.
traditionally, I think conversation around sexuality has been more visible and more accessible than conversation around gender identity. And so
Hmm.
people have kind of found their way through conversations of sexuality to a more diverse understanding of gender.
Mm.
But I do think that these things are entangled. You're so right that they're entangled. And increasingly, despite the move towards a much more conservative model in governance, certainly in the UK,
Mm.
and in some, although certainly not all, sections of the media, we are seeing an increasingly almost revolutionary mingling of sexuality and gender.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So you were saying about your research
Mm,
background, and you mentioned about the relationship between language and identity,
mm.
and that you love linguistics as well. So, yeah, I like language as well, and everything related to it. And also, mostly I'm into writing systems. I'm a bit of a nerd for
Oh,
that, but like,
yes.
yeah. But yeah, languages are so interesting. So, what is it that you've found? Well, and when you say the relationship between language and identity, what is something you've found very, what's the word? Prominent?
I mean, fantastic question. Thank you. I'd also love to hear more about writing systems. That sounds amazing. So broadly speaking, my PhD is on something like the history of reading, and specifically reading, thinking about how we might read history in a queer way.
Mm.
And part of that is I did some bits and pieces of Latin translation,
Hmm.
and that sparked a kind of love of linguistics in me that I've pursued independently since. I feel like
Hmm.
I should stress, I crucially, I don't have much of a talent for linguistics. I definitely have an enthusiasm, but I don't have the knack that some people have who
Oh.
can just sort of pick these things up. So anything I say comes with a kind of dubious expertise where I have studied it for years and years and years and years, but I'm not very good at it. But I suppose one of the things we think about, I guess to talk about it in very broad terms, one of the things we think about when we are reading the past, and particularly when we're reading the past in another language, is the essential idea of translation. So
Mm.
translation is a Latin word. It's from translatus, which is, this is going to be very, very boring. It's the past participle of transfere, which also gives us the word transfer. But we don't need to really worry about that. What it means is to bring across the gap,
Mm.
to
Hmm.
bring across the width of something.
Hmm.
And I've always loved that, because while etymology absolutely isn't the sole determiner of meaning,
Mm.
it does, I think, remind us that translation isn't just a simple sort of GCSE Spanish act of finding the word in English and matching it to the
Mm.
equivalent word, that it is a journey across a distance. It's a negotiation, a navigation.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so when we're looking at something like Latin, so the texts I'm looking at are in the 16th century. They're histories, they're religious texts, and they're written in what was falling out of vogue, but still very much in certain sectors a language of its time. we're simultaneously coming across the linguistic gap, we're also coming across the temporal gap, the cultural gap. And like the act of translation isn't just one of saying, I'm going to make this language legible. And in fact, that's probably the point at which I fail most in my work. It's one of saying, like, I'm going to engage with the hopeless task of making recognizable the unrecognizable culture and behavior and like historical moment of the
Mm.
past. And you know, like there's no way that you can make anything like what might be called an accurate translation,
Mm.
because the minute that you touch it, you get your stuff all over it, you get your damage all over it, you know that you get your,
Totally.
it's like there's this weird prevailing idea that old books are put in archives to make sure that nobody touches them, because if people touch them, they'll get their grubby little fingers all over them and they'll damage the books.
Mm.
And with the exception of like some very rare papyri, and sort of like, you know, disintegrating papers and so on and so forth, like the opposite is true. The reason they're in the archive is so that people can still get them out 400 years later, and you're supposed to handle them and they're supposed to be touched.
Mm.
And I think that this is all very queer, because we are just staring into this thing that in the very act of us touching it, recognizes how other it is, recognizes that we can't really properly understand it, that we can't really match
Mm.
it word for word, that any act of trying to translate even a small chunk of the past is to say, like, you are so different to me, and I am
Mm.
changing you even more as I try
Mm.
and bring you across this gap, because whether we like it or not, we are always projecting ourselves onto them. You know, like,
Mm.
I always think that the reason there are so many conversations about whether or not Shakespeare was gay, which he almost certainly was, right? Like, he was this like fruity theatre guy who hung around with some of London's most notorious queers. There's absolutely no chance he wasn't at least bisexual. But I think the reason that these conversations come up so much is because he looks like what we think a bisexual looks like, because he's like a fruity guy with the hair, and he's in theatre, and he's hanging around with all of these other fruity guys, and he's got a slightly suspect relationship with women, and
Mm.
like that makes sense to us. That's a sort of camp archetype that we've created to define ourselves by. And I always
Mm.
think, but like, why aren't we looking for like the queer venerable Bede? Like, why aren't we looking for like, you know, any other historical figures' queerness? Because there aren't really any rules on what queerness is, and we've broadly accepted that cultures and behaviors and ideas of gender and sexuality shift radically over time. And
Mm.
I just think that that queerness that doesn't look like us is present in every translation we make. Every time, every attempt we make to try and recover the past, we recognize that difference, that rupture from the
Mm.
past. And in that difference, in that rupture, in like the bits that aren't there,
Mm.
I think a whole queer history is quietly existing.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's also obviously you only have what's written down.
Mm,
What is not
exactly.
written down, you who knows, right? And then there's the translation, I guess, from maybe one language to another, but also from one time into the other. And even looking back, like in modern day, I guess now, so much is changing and so fast, and so much has changed, and some in some aspects, not enough has changed. You know? Yeah,
Mm. But and also
yeah.
like as the speed of change increases, and this is something I think Walter Benjamin wrote about, with the idea of like the angel of history, this figure that like stands trying to brace itself against the like the blast of wind moving towards us from the future, and the rubble builds up around it, and all it can do is like try and stand its ground in the face of like the constant barrage of progress. And I think
Mm,
I think he was right, and as the deluge of information of kind of like history making continues to hit us from the future faster and faster, we lose more. Like
Mm.
there's so much. We talk about old books in archives and what we've saved versus what we haven't saved, and how that creates a certain kind of what you might call normative history, which is so often straight
Yeah.
history, cis history, etc.,
Right.
etc. But even now, like we feel like because we can take refuge in places like the internet or in like digital media, that we've solved the problem. But we lose more information than we save. Like already forms of physical media that we invented in the 80s, the 90s, the noughties are defunct. Like there are mini discs, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain kinds of like tape-based physical media that we can't read anymore because we just stopped making the machines that can read them. We just
Mm.
created like dead information. And I think that too is like a much more recent kind of queer history in the making. Like it's not just about the people who we might find in history and call queer because it's a person who was assigned male at birth, to use the lexicon of our times, but dressed as a woman or something, and we sort of point at them and say that's a queer. It's a much more comprehensive exercise of trying to read what we didn't write down, of trying to
Mm.
read what's not there,
Mm.
of kind of existing in the spaces in between things.
Mm. Yeah. Ooh, gosh, this is a rabbit hole I could easily go down, and with various,
Yeah,
various, various other. It's a big rabbit hole. Let's put it
I
that way.
did for 5
Yeah,
years. Yeah,
yeah,
it's I can confirm that it just keeps going. You run out of
yeah.
money before you run out of rabbit hole.
Oh, totally. So, do you feel going down that rabbit hole has given you any clarity about your own identity, or helped give language to your own identity?
So short answer, no and yes.
Okay.
Long answer, I think it gave a helpful obscurity to my relationship to my own identity,
Hmm.
in that I was talking to a friend who's half Japanese, half English a little while ago. We went for a
Mm.
walk during the depths of the pandemic.
Mm.
And we were talking about gender, as you do on your long pandemic walks. And they said, I didn't think about gender in this particular way until I started thinking about it in English, because we don't use gendered pronouns in the same way in Japanese. And I
Mm.
speak a little Japanese, not very well, but a couple of my language partners, we've had this conversation before about how in Japanese English conversations around gender, particularly in sort of multilingual feminist societies, you sometimes have these disclaimers appended at the front about like that are basically to the tune of like, please don't feel offended if we accidentally misgender you. We're not doing it on purpose. It's a linguistic thing. And I think that that kind of thinking outside the particular terminological box that I spent a long time putting myself in, being like, it's because in English, it's absolutely important that you refer to people with the right gendered pronouns, because you're not just being respectful to them, you're making a
Mm.
political point.
Mm.
But that doesn't work across every language. And
Yeah.
the broader reflection that I had in the course of my research on how it's not just that that doesn't work across every language, it's that it actually doesn't work especially well outside our quite narrow span of time. And that
Mm.
what we think of as trans identities. So a great example might be the current production on at the Globe, about Joan of Arc, which is kicked up a huge stink in all of the usual suspects in the media because they're casting Joan of Arc as a non-binary person. And I think this is like both very politically relevant, very socially relevant. I'm sure
Mhm.
it'll sell tickets, but it's also an interesting way to engage with the complicated narrative around the gender of Joan of Arc.
Mm.
I think it's going to be great, and I think everybody should go and see it. I certainly will. But there are some people on our side of things who are saying, Like, finally, we're recognizing that Joan of Arc was a trans person. And while I think that that is, yes, a great thing to make a play about, I don't think that we, as queer historians or as queer readers of history, should say conclusive things like, well, finally, Joan of Arc is a trans person.
Mm.
And you see similar projects happening all the time with the sexuality and gender identity of Virginia Woolf or Louisa May Alcott. And what it does is, rather than liberating queer history, it projects our hard-won political ideas of ourselves back onto it and says, well, actually, this person has to be this thing. And that feels to me so regressive sometimes.
Mm.
Sorry, this is a personal point of frustration for me. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people listening who don't agree, and that's absolutely
Mm.
fine. This is
Totally.
just a personal beef I have. But
Yeah.
like, I think as feminists, as queer theorists, as queer liberators, one thing we're always trying to do, pretty much unilaterally, is say in the broadest terms, like, you shouldn't dictate the parameters of someone's gender. You shouldn't dictate the parameters of someone's sexuality. You shouldn't
Mm.
limit what they can be based on what you think they should be.
Mm.
And so I think we should celebrate new attempts to investigate the diversity of gender and sexuality that exists in history, but not receive them as kind of having the final word, saying, well, so and so has finally been claimed as trans, so and so has
Mm.
finally been claimed as gay, particularly when so and so was living in a culture, in a language, in a time where their experience of sexuality or gender would have been totally unrecognizable to us. And like, the umbrella
Yeah.
term of queer is useful here to signify that that is what we're talking about, that we're
Mm.
talking about the fluctuations of gender and sexuality over time, and the way that the cis heteropatriarchal machine of history has flattened that.
Mm.
But I think that we in turn should not flatten it. And so by doing this work in my research, I think I'd actually, as I'm sure you can tell, but by the fact that I won't stop bashing on about this, became very passionate about the unflattening of queerness in general. And so when I reflected on my own identity, on how I read myself, on how I think of myself as someone who is in a way producing queer history as part of my research, the writing of my thesis,
Mhm.
and establishing myself in relationship to this tradition of historians and historiographers, I think my sense of identity became more diffuse and less clear,
Mm.
because I don't even know how to. I don't think I've actually thought about this hard for a long time, perhaps ever. My
Yeah.
head is cooking off. It's something like, because prior to thinking about it that way, I think I'd thought of my own queer identity as something that belonged to now, that belonged to a political struggle, to a
Mm.
movement.
Mm.
But when I think of it as something that is part of history, I
Mm.
think I feel my grip relax a little.
Interesting. Yeah, if you think about it, because from where we are all at now, we look back onto history a lot because that's kind of all we can see, like
Exactly.
looking back. But at some point, like in 50 years, we're going to be part of that history, and other people are going to be looking back. Well, some of us too, but others, some of us not. So, yeah, and another 50 years, other people are going to be looking back, and we're going to be part of this, like the current soup of what's going on now.
For
Yeah.
sure, yeah. And I mean, I even think that, like, I would even go so far as to say that it's not even that linear, that, like,
Mm.
because we, as human beings in general, experience time as broadly
Yeah.
going from point A to point B,
Yeah.
certain late nights notwithstanding, we tend to see things
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that does give us the advantage of hindsight on the people
Mm-hmm.
who came before us. But, like, so there's this jellyfish
Mm-hmm.
called the Immortal Jellyfish. The Latin name is Turritopsis dornii, but it's called the Immortal Jellyfish.
Mm-hmm.
And it has this thing where if it's sick or damaged or too old, it can return from the Medusa, which is like the grown-up,
Mm.
recognizable jellyfish, big bell on top, long wiggly bits underneath that we all know and love,
Mm.
back into a kind of baby jellyfish called a polyp.
Mm-hmm.
And this process is called transdifferentiation, and it's literally just that its cells go back along its timeline and it starts its life process again.
Wow.
It's not reproductive, it's not, it just, to our perspective as humans, traveling a long time from point A to point B as we do in units of 50 years,
Mm.
the jellyfish is going forwards and backwards along its own timeline.
Mm.
But from the jellyfish's perspective, I do sort of think that we must be like hopelessly lost, like only able to go in one direction. And I sometimes
Yeah.
think about like, what what if what if queer history is like jellyfish history? Like we think of ourselves not just as the successors to or the descendants of those who came before, but as, in a closer context, if we go into an
Mm.
archive and we take out a book and we open up that book and it's from the 16th century, let's say, then we are touching the same pages that our historical history making antecedents 500 years ago, 600 years ago touched. Like we are
Mm.
one thin sheet of paper away from skin to skin contact.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
those touches aren't something that's recorded, but they are there in the physical properties. And this is, again, I think, another way
Mm.
of thinking about queer history as the things that aren't written but are there. And that
Mm.
while we are part of history in the sense that the things that we don't think of as history right now are happening right now as history for someone 50 years from now.
Mm.
In the same way, we're always part of history in the sense that our interactions with it have an immediacy that is much, much closer and much, much more intimate. And I think, or sometimes kind of erotic in the like most essential sense of being about touch, of being about proximity,
Mm.
than a gap of 500 years might say. Like 500 years ago is like dust and death and bones, and everybody from them exists only in quaint pictures. Pretty
Mm.
much everything before the advent of photography feels to us like a sort of hopelessly unreal fantasy time. And
Mm.
yet it is like very possible to go and to almost touch those people. And I think time does function just differently in those moments. That's
Mm.
jellyfish time.
Jellyfish time. I like that. Like a non-linear. Yeah, like the linear versus non-linear as well. That's another
Yeah,
rabbit hole, isn't it? Yeah.
exactly. And like, what
Yeah.
is what what is what is seeking out the sort of the sensationally non-linear, the sort of thrill of something slightly closer against the forces of linearity and singularity and
Mm.
normativity,
Mm.
if not queerness.
Mm.
I think like, I don't know. Perhaps it's just because it's obviously a subject I love and I'm a bit of a wonk about it, and I want other people to be a bit of a wonk about it as well. But I think there is so much to be said for history, for reading, for linguistics, for translation,
Mm.
about getting out of the mindset of analyzing these things and putting them in order and into just like seeking the thrill of contact with something remote.
Mm. Yeah. I just got a visual of something like if you think back to history and colonialism and like indigenous gender identities and like how they are now compared to what they were like before colonialism as well. Like I'm just suddenly getting this graph in front of me. Like, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much to be said about that. I was going to say that it could fill books, and it has actually filled some great books. But yeah, like I think the relative fluidity. So I'm not an expert in Indigenous studies at all, but the relative fluidity and relative diversity of sexual and gender identities in a number of Indigenous peoples, both historical and extant, I think broadly speaks to the natural diversity of gender and sexuality in
Mm-hmm.
humans,
Mm-hmm.
in the world in general. But also, I think, is used particularly if we look at like North American Indigenous peoples, for instance, the way in which colonialism, certainly, but specifically capitalism as an instrument of like binarity of gender and sexuality is used
Mm-hmm.
against sort of existing cultures of fluidity
Mm.
and diversity.
Yeah.
And that this colonization is like obviously like geographical, political, colonial, but it's also temporal. Like we have retroactively colonized time to an extraordinary extent. The zone of human time in which gender binary, sort of normative heterosexuality, cis heteropatriarchy. Well, maybe less so patriarchy. Actually, I'm going to walk that one back. But like these
Mm.
things have been sort of broadly a cultural norm on any scale is tiny. Like
Mm.
we have been doing things that way for hardly any time at all. And that's
Mm.
not to
Yeah.
say that there hasn't always, in one form or another, been something like normativity,
Mm.
like discrimination. The Roman poet Catullus is absolutely having sex with both men and women, and he does get made fun of for he writes some love poetry and which begins, I can't remember how it begins, but the famous line goes, "Dami basia et centum altera usque et mille," something like that. Give me kisses, then 100 more, all the way to 1,000. And his mates in the forum start making fun of him for being effeminate, and they basically call him a bottom. And it's the same. And it's this kind of like prejudice that we recognize today against effeminate men who have sex with
Mm.
men, and so on and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. And so, the start of his next poem, he writes, "Ego vos pedicabo et irumabo," which means I'm going to fuck you first in the face and then in the ass, to kind of like establish himself. So obviously, these like
Yeah.
were problematic discourses of sexuality and gender have always existed. But the point is that this
Yeah.
idea that like heterosexuality or binary gender or whatever are traditional or
Mm.
like historically normal or
Mm-hmm.
normative is
Mm-hmm.
totally absurd. It's an
Yeah.
invention. Honestly, I would go so far as to say it's certainly colonial. I would go so far as to say it's industrial and it's capitalist, and that has then just been projected back through time, and
Mm.
because we are told that that is the way that humans work, that that is the way that time works, that that is the way that history works.
Mm.
We start believing that. We start building that into our day to day lives. I'm not arguing that we should dissolve all of sexual and gender difference across all of history into a sort of soup. I feel like that has the same kind of thrust as like the love is love slogan, which sort of is nice enough on the surface, but operates on the idea that we're going to make queer love acceptable by saying it's the same as non-queer
Mm.
love, rather that like across the span of human time, our experiences of sexuality and gender have been so radically different and so radically changing that
Mm.
there is no way that we could extract like a continuous norm. And so we just sort of like tell this lie of history to try and
Mm.
enforce one, because that's how capitalist ideology functions. Because
Mm.
like, I mean, I won't go into a whole Marxist analysis of it, but because that's how like control of social reproduction functions, it's how labor functions, and so on
Mm.
and so forth.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you think about. I had a conversation with a Two-Spirit woman
Mm,
for the podcast a little while ago, and we talked a lot about colonialism and all that stuff. And yeah, it's so interesting when you look at the reinforcing of these new normative rules, and how it
Mm.
only takes a few generations for that to become really ingrained, and people don't know any better anymore, and like disconnect from their history in a way that, yeah, we almost become these like blind followers of normativity, don't we? And we don't
Mm.
question it until, I don't know, some of us don't ever question it, I suppose, but
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
And you almost can't blame people.
Mm,
Like I think a great example is the burning of the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft in Berlin in the 1930s, where it's
mm,
this enormous, like, international library of literature on gender identity,
mm,
sexuality, on like the sort of nascent craft of gender identity services.
mm,
Um, and it's destroyed in the early Nazi book burnings.
mm,
And it's just astonishing how successful it was. Like,
mm,
because it was a concentrated source of knowledge for a
mm,
marginalized community with a sort of like limited understanding and limited like means of transmission of knowledge. It
mm,
successfully, particularly in Europe, destroyed awareness of that community, like acceptance of that community, like
mm,
research and thought and philosophy around that community for generations. We're
mm,
still suffering from it.
mm,
And I'm very suspicious of people who make claims to historical truth, because I feel like they're always
mm,
underlaid by this idea that my version of events is right and someone, which necessarily means that someone else's version of events is wrong. And
mm,
that's not to say that we should allow any kind of dangerous historical revisionism. Obviously, colonialism is built on a foundation of denying atrocities and genocides, and it's so,
mm,
so important that we recognize those. But I think that rather redoubles the fact that history shouldn't be based on saying, on going to war over whose version of events is right, but on
mm,
having the way that we make history driven by, I guess, like moral reasons. Like we do this as
mm,
something that uplifts the marginalized, that recognizes them, that makes space for the people who are forgotten by the path that's
mm.
forged by history makers. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's shocking how easy it is to retroactively change and destroy history. And I think
Mm,
something that should be a cause for concern for us right now in the UK, where, we increasingly are being propelled by the government, by certain sections of the media towards a new Section 28 and the associated silences, the sort of small library burnings, as it were, that come with it. I think it's something that's really worth bearing in mind, that when
mm,
these aren't things that are limited to the past. These
mm. Totally.
destructions of knowledge.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even if you look at what's happening in the US with reproductive rights, you could
Exactly.
call that a modern day witch hunt because that's exactly what it is. It's all about control of women, you
Mm.
know. Yeah. Wow. Gosh, this is so interesting. Like, I think I could talk to you for hours about this. Really.
I,
Yeah.
I, I'm so, so glad. Yeah, no, it's a real passion of mine, and I think sometimes it's hard to get it out of. Well, I say it's hard. I think sometimes I make it needlessly difficult to get it out of the sort of constant guff of academia. But there is just, I think, a really important sense in which so much is unwritten, unremarked, uncelebrated. And I feel very passionately, I would want that lots of people felt passionately to about not even just restoring, just thinking about, reconnecting with, I suppose, those absences, giving
Mm,
space in our queer histories for the people who aren't there.
mm. Yeah, absolutely.
And, I suppose the recognition that brings with it that when we talk about
Mm.
like how we talked earlier about how in 50 years will be history,
Yeah.
like it's funny how we talk about what people in the future will think of us, that we always think that it's us that they'll be thinking of. We never think like, oh, in 50 years, I'll be one of the dead spots. I will be one of the
Yeah.
forgotten.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think that's part of it as well. It's like a recognizing that if our tradition is one of people who went unrecorded, of sort of moments that have been lost, of books that have been burned,
Mm.
then by honoring that and recognizing that, I think we also, draw strength for ourselves as the people who might be forgotten, as the books that might be
Mm.
burned.
Yeah, that's making me think of like another layer to the term like survival instinct. I think it's more than just
Mm.
physical, it's also like historical in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that if you read history across a long enough period of time, you see that moment of thinking about survival come up time and time again. Often in the
Mm.
context of legacy, lots of people
Yeah,
who write books do so because in
they
one
want
way
to
or
leave
another,
something behind. Yeah.
yeah, they want to leave something
Mm.
behind. So like the incredible writer Montaigne, one of the best, I guess in many ways, the founder of the modern idea of the essay in Europe, but also just a astonishing capacity for self-reflection, has like the exact nature of it isn't really known, but basically has a number of genitourinary problems, particularly towards the end of his life. And
Mm.
what he does is he builds himself this incredible library and intends to practice this scholarly ideal by, like, as he gets older, retiring into his library and just like living out a fulfilling life of reading and knowledge gathering.
Mm.
But the older he gets, the more pain he's in. It interferes with his reproductive function, and this like challenge to his ability to procreate, to his physical well-being, in a
Mm.
certain sense to his sexuality, one imagines, that's
Mm.
coming, that is like his body physically betrays him,
Mm.
increasingly manifests in his essays as thoughts of historical continuity. He talks about the Roman writers Seneca and Plutarch and says, everything I've made is built entirely from their spoils, like the kind of rubble I've taken away from them.
Mm.
Um, and sort of perceives himself as like all of this writing that he's like really like tearing himself apart over. Like he properly goes on a journey to the depths of the soul and like puts himself out there in terms of like his pain and his anguish and his hopes and his dreams, and thinks
Mm.
like, if any of this lasts, I won't have any control over what happens to it. It will be
Mm.
so much dust, so many fragments that are picked
Mm.
up by others and used to build what they are. And so it's his hope and
Yeah.
his frustration are bound into this one drive to survive. And the one that really gets me is, stop me if this is boring, by the way. I realize I'm going like
it's
long on
it's
the.
not boring. It's
I'm,
not boring, but like one of the things I was thinking about, and then whoever reads it or takes it in the future does so from their time and their own personal perspective, and like it is taken in a way that is like also out of their control.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. We are
it's
we are
also
just constant.
fluid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. And I guess this is what I meant earlier about like finding space for those moments of touch in the archives, or like I'm lucky enough to go to a church that is, something's been on the site for close to 1,000 years, but the building itself is not quite that old. I think elements of it are about 600 years old, but there are people who have been worshipping here for centuries,
Mm-hmm.
and like we can bear witness to that with like the history of the church,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of thinking about religious history and the Reformation and the role that Norwich had to
Mm.
play in that, and Norwich's history of like religious reform and religious rebellion and so on and so forth.
Mm.
But lots of those ways of talking about it distance us from it. But there is a sense when that, during the Eucharist, for instance, that you are kneeling and praying in the spot where someone has been doing the exact same thing, and notwithstanding a few, like, admittedly incredibly culturally significant changes of words and language, doing the same action.
Mm.
And in those moments, it's not 600 years. It's a totally different kind of time. And I think finding those moments is really important because it does let us backtrack a bit. It does let us sort of touch and thank and sort of confront perhaps sometimes these people who left the fragments that we're now scraping up, and just because we may not properly know them, but that doesn't mean that we can't witness them. This also makes me think about our historical responsibility to the present. There's this Roman writer Tacitus who angsts at length, and I generalize in the extreme here, so if there are any Tacitus scholars listening to this, forgive me, but all around him, people are either getting their heads knocked off or falling on their swords in sort of the gallant tradition of Roman suicide. It's like a terrible period of history as the Roman Republic really starts to collapse and factionalize after a period of relatively increased liberty and prosperity. And he sort of sees heads rolling around him, and goes back and forth constantly on like whether the historian's responsibility is to write all of this down and kind of keep it for the future so that some future generation might see what happened to us and learn from it, or whether it's more noble to do the honorable thing now. And he's very bitter on the Roman concept of honor, of dying with honor. He has no patience for this kind of like bloody masculinity. But I think there is a challenge in that, particularly to those of us who are queer historians or who have a queer relationship with history, where we see what's happening now in the UK and other places around the world. And I think lots of us think to ourselves, like, where is a point going to come? Is something happening right now where I make a choice between what is right and what is safe? Do we, if the time comes that metaphorically or literally, however it happens, heads are rolling and people are falling on swords, do we throw ourselves on the swords because it's the right thing to do? Do we keep our heads down in the hopes that we might be able to take something to another generation and make them less sword vulnerable? Do we advocate that to our friends, our loved ones? Do we encourage the communities that we defend to put themselves in harm's way and stand up, or to keep themselves out of harm's way and to keep their heads down? And I think it's the harder things, the more the UK backslides on these things, the harder a question it is, because I always think for myself, I think that it's been 2,000 years since Tacitus and we still fundamentally haven't learned the sword lesson. Surely holding on for future generations has not worked out. And so therefore therefore I would be compelled to stand up. But then the more likely it looks that things might in my lifetime become dangerous or more dangerous, the more that is really tested. And so when we talk about how people will look back on us in 50 years, I think a big part of that is thinking about like the difference between our historical responsibility to the future and our historical responsibility to the present, and what that means for us as a queer community.
Yeah, that is such a good point. Because I think a lot of us mistakenly, but understandably, assume that our choices don't really have an impact, like a wider impact, but they totally do. But we feel, a lot of the time, I think we feel powerless. But yeah, which is unfortunate and misguided, I think. But as I said, it's understandable that people feel that way and think that way. And I think that is part of oppression, isn't it? Make the people feel powerless to change anything.
Absolutely, yeah. And I will say there is like a sustained campaign of disempowerment happening at the moment in the UK, particularly in the media, particularly in government,
Mm.
particularly targeting trans people. And that one of the things that I say a lot at things like the Norwich Pride event, for instance,
Mm.
is that like it is true that we are powerless in certain contexts,
Hmm.
um, or that we may as well be powerless in certain contexts. Obviously, nobody is ever truly powerless, but
Mm.
that we are significantly disempowered in certain
Mm.
contexts. You know,
Yeah.
the trans community is unlikely to have a big steer in choosing the next prime minister, for instance, but that the feelings of powerlessness, and particularly the feeling that we may as well not stand up or not act on our fury, our sadness, our feelings of moral responsibility,
Mm.
because nothing will happen. If we feel that way, then that is a success on the part of our oppressors because they are trying to engender that feeling of powerlessness so that we
Exactly.
won't act. It's not that we don't take action because we are powerless. It's that we don't take action because we have been made to feel powerless.
Mm.
And I think there is so much value, partially, in doing even the smallest that you can, even the most local, the most simple actions of support, of organization within your communities make a difference. And even if it's not a choosing the prime minister level difference, it's still a difference.
Mm.
Um, like partially because you can, if you make one person's life better, that is one more than zero, but also because like you can just do the right thing. Like this is a personal belief rather than like an abstract truth, but like
Mm.
doing things even though they're probably fruitless or even though you're kind of powerlessness, but they're still right, has its own value to it. And I think there is power in that, when
Mm.
political disenfranchisement that can't take that power away from you.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it's so important to get a sense of. I think you can get lost in this sense of like, I have to do meaningful things. Whereas sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is something small for yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I think my personal stance on it is that we simultaneously need to be sensitive to the fact that everyone has their own capacity for action, and that if we don't respect that, we are no better than our oppressors. Like
Mm.
we cannot push everyone in our community, for instance, to a particular baseline of action, because in doing so, we already exclude people who can't meet whatever standard we set. That
Totally.
said, I do
Mm.
think it's good to push ourselves to find what is meaningful, not just in a sort of eat, pray, love sense, although I love eating, praying, and loving. And I think all of these things are very, very good and everyone should do more of them. Um, but in a sense of like really drilling down into like what it means to be part of the queer community, what we can do for our queer community and doing those things. And like
Mm.
you say, they can be small things, but yeah. I'm sometimes reminded of a particular brand of feminism that flourished in the sort of early 2010s, late noughties. It was not that
Mm.
dissimilar to rainbow capitalism. There was a sudden pivot to lots and lots of brands being sort of like doing this is what a feminist looks like style merch, kind of like putting on lipstick is feminist now, like working in finance is girl power, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And I don't want to make like an incredibly shallow feminist analysis here, but there's a certain way in which that kind of talking about it co-opted the language of like a very serious liberatory movement of gender and sexuality and all of these things, and sort of made it into repackaged it as a message that said feminism is about you. It's about the way that you feel. It's about the things that make you happy. And that can be true, but crucially, I don't think it can be just about that. And I do think that that
Mm.
kind of individualism is capitalist. And I think there's a similar thing when we think about what we can be empowered to do for our communities, that like we can and should do small good things for ourselves and look after ourselves and be kind to ourselves and respect our boundaries,
Mm.
but that kind of healthy relationship to our lives shouldn't, I think, lay the groundwork for a kind of insular way of living where we put ourselves ahead of our communities, where we say, well, I'm in the queer community and therefore doing things that make me feel better are actions for the queer community. So long as we do so in a healthy way, we should always be turning our gaze outwards, always be seeing, well, if I'm at my limit at this point, is there anyone who is already struggling here? I've done hand gestures for that, and that was really unhelpful for your listeners at home. Imagine, if you will, that my hand is up here for the first one and down low for the second one.
That's good. Yeah.
I'll paint them a word picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that's what I mean, that, you know, part of being empowered to make change is like really pushing ourselves to connect, to support others, to not fall into the trap of thinking that because it is right and good to look after ourselves, that looking after ourselves in and of itself is a kind of queer praxis, or, you know, like, I think we all need to change it very, very slightly and say that, like, if there is nothing else that we can do, if we are totally overpowered, the thing that we can do is look after each other.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
There's an academic called Robin Weigman. I'm never sure if it's Weigman or Wiegman. I've never heard it said aloud. Sorry, Robin, if you somehow are listening to this. In the conclusion, oh, is it Robin? It's either her or it's Diane Watt and Roberta Magnani. Anyway, doesn't matter. At the end, in the end of a wonderful book called The Lesbian Pre-Modern, she, or they, depending on whether I've got the writer right, talks about how one of the paradigms of queer history is love. And that while we often look at time, we talked earlier about time as a vector for history and how time isn't always the same distance depending on how you encounter it. Love is
Mm.
one way of thinking about arranging queer history that isn't chronological, thinking of the way that we relate to our past as a series of different ways of loving, a series of different kinds of love or journeys of love. And I
Mm.
suppose that's also what informs my thoughts on being disempowered, and how we can work around that is
Mm.
that in all too recent history, we have had laws against the ways that we love. We are still attacked for the ways that we love. We are still
Mm.
discriminated against for the ways that we love. We talked about book burnings, like even our most fundamental understandings and knowledges about how we love can be taken away. But fundamentally, it can't be, the root of it can't be pulled up. It's like Japanese knotweed, it just keeps coming back. And that is true of the ways that we relate to each other. There's always power in looking out for the people around you, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I find it such a fine balance. Like, if you're learning, for example, for me, I realized with the help of some therapy that I was just raised as a complete people pleaser,
Mm.
had no boundaries really and all that stuff. So I've been learning more about that recently. And I feel like the better I get, it sounds almost counterintuitive, but like the better I get at that thing of setting boundaries, looking after my own needs, the more actually I have to give to other people,
Yes.
which is
Yeah.
really interesting,
No, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's absolutely
Mhm.
true. I've had a very similar conversation with my girlfriend the other day, where she said to me, what was it she said? Something like, we were talking about this exact issue, and she said something like, it's really important to take time for oneself
Mm.
so that you can be a better lover, friend, companion, community member. I absolutely don't mean to suggest that we should to rehabilitate that very Roman idea of throwing ourselves on our swords at the first sign of trouble and sort of actually preventing ourselves from doing good by overly sacrificing ourselves.
Mm.
But that I do think that there is sometimes a culture of well-being, I guess, that gets thrown around where we sometimes lose. It's the same culture that belongs to things like retail therapy and corporate yoga retreats and like taking a plane to go on holiday because you sort of know that it's bad for the environment, but you think that you should be allowed a treat. Like
Mm.
it's the mindset that says to you that oversteps that line that says we need to keep ourselves strong and healthy and to set productive boundaries because these things make us. And when I say strong
Mm.
and healthy, I don't really mean physically. I mean like emotionally, spiritually.
Yeah, totally.
Like because we need to because these things make us better people because they give us the energy that we need because they help us be friends and lovers and companions and community members. But I
Mm.
think sometimes that culture oversteps that line into it's always okay for us to focus on ourselves and
Like
to give
toxic
up
levels of that. Yeah.
because that's what makes us happy and because
Mm.
it's important for us to be happy so that we can help other people. I don't think I have any solutions to this. I think it's something that I constantly go back and forth on, but that I do if I had if I have a particular soapbox behind besides my boring history stuff, it is that capitalism, colonialism, these things that we've talked about all thrive on the idea of the individual, on the idea that
Mm.
you are entitled to your own labor, on the idea that the people who work hardest get the most, this
Mm.
sorts of thing.
Yeah.
And I think as a result, I am just in the healthiest, most nourishing, most boundary setting, reflective way, very suspicious of cultures, ways of thinking, perhaps, that prioritize the individual over the
Mm.
community.
Mm.
And, you know, it's all very grand to talk about this in political or philosophical terms or whatever, but I think when it gets back down to it, it's actually something much more basic and straightforwardly said, which is that like a lot of us are just out here trying to, on the one hand, be good people, and on the other hand, be healthy people. And
Mm.
sometimes it's hard to keep the hands balanced, and we're all just
Totally.
doing our best every day.
Yeah, it is a fine balance, isn't it? Wow. Gosh, lots to ponder and think about. Thank you so much for sharing.
No, no, thank you. This has been delightful. Honestly, I feel like I could talk about this stuff for hours, but
Yeah.
yeah, no, thank you for giving me so much space to talk on.
You're welcome. Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. It made me think about time and history and like linearity or not. And like, oh, you know,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, partially that's really fabulous, and I love these conversations, and I love when conversations make you think that way. This is
Mm.
also like a huge boost to my ego because like PhD research is like a notorious silo. Like you go in there and you talk to the same two or three people about it for 5 years, and then you come out and discover that nobody will ever read what you've written, and so
Gosh.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, being given a platform for my ridiculous ideas is truly a blessing.
You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Cleo, where you can also read the transcript. And you can find Cleo on Twitter. Links are on the episode page. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, on social media, and on YouTube. Again, if you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open minded.
Oh, I'm losing my train of thought. Um, I'm so sorry. What were we talking about?
Oh, that's so good. Normally, I'm like, I get to that place a lot quicker. Like, what was the question?
Yes.
I'm always going there. Gosh, um, yeah, gosh. Let me see where my brain went. Um, yeah, what was I
So we're
thinking
talking
about?
about
Yeah, hmm
our. We're talking about feelings of powerlessness. That was it.
yeah,
Okay, cool.